Brief power interruptions in the city that could have been related to a hillfire. The government and Beijing rejected critical U.S. report in Hong Kong. Giant floating cranes arrive in Baltimore to deal with the wreckage from a fallen bridge. Good evening, and thank you for joining us. There were reports of brief power interruptions across the city today. Fire services personnel received more than 50 incidents involving people being trapped in elevators in Kowloon and the New Territories. The incidents are suspected to be related to a CLP overhead power line tower being affected by a Jin Yong wildfire. Timothy Lee tells us more.
The blaze broke out at Sha Pa Heung on a hill near Songshan New Village. The flames consumed half the hillside, while thick smoke covered the overhead power line. Fire services personnel arrived at the scene at around noon, with government flying service helicopters hovering above and spraying water in a bid to put out the fire. Authorities noted several areas in the city experienced voltage dips half an hour after the fire began. They received over 50 reports of people being trapped in elevators between 12:30 and 1:30 p.m. Most reports came from areas including Polam, Chuen Wan, Kwun Tong, and Yamate. Besides elevators, there were brief power interruptions in some restaurants, such as this one in Sham Shui Po. The restaurant owner said the lights went out momentarily before everything returned to normal, adding that he knew it was caused by a voltage dip. Meanwhile, another two locations on Hong Kong Island were also affected. Elevator incidents were reported at Tung Wai Eastern Hospital and the Sai Pun MTR station. CLP Group said the overhead power line connecting Yuen Long and Lai Chi Kok recorded a voltage dip at 12:28 p.m. Preliminary investigations suspect the power line tower was affected by the wildfire, a suspicion that was echoed by some electrical engineers.
It is believed that there is a wildfire happened or occurred beneath overhead line tower, and the ash has reduced the insulation level of the overhead line above. As you know, the voltage level of this of this tower is up to 400 kilowatt, which is a very high voltage, and with such a high voltage, the affected area will be very large.
The city faced two instances of voltage dips that led to large-scale power outages over the past year, but Ho believes the latest incident had an unrelated cause. Timothy Lee, TVB News.
The United States has passed a 2024 Hong Kong Policy Act report. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken said they are taking steps to impose new visa restrictions on some Hong Kong officials. The Commissioner's Office of the Foreign Ministry in Hong Kong and the SAR government issued statements expressing opposition and strong condemnation over the inaccurate statements and smears made by Washington. Just a week after the Safeguarding National Security Bill was gazetted, the U.S. passed a 2024 Hong Kong Policy Act report, which criticized the SAR's situation in politics, human rights, and rule of law. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken also issued a statement saying that in the past year, China continued to take action against Hong Kong's promised high degree of autonomy, while criticizing Hong Kong's recent implementation of the legislation of Article 23. Blinken said new visa restrictions will be imposed on multiple SAR officials responsible for the suppressing of Hong Kong people's rights and freedoms. The SAR government issued a statement strongly condemning the false stories and wanton slanders by the United States. The statement said the false narratives were clearly crafted to serve the political interests of the U.S., which is grossly interfering in Hong Kong affairs, which are China's internal affairs. The attempt to undermine the stability and prosperity of Hong Kong only exposes the slyness of the U.S. The so-called sanctions smacks of despicable political manipulation. The U.S. also criticizes the lack of a fair trial for national security-related defendants because of restrictions for them to be able to be represented by overseas lawyers. The Hong Kong government said in the U.S. there is no regime for ad hoc admission of overseas lawyers, similar to that in Hong Kong, which highlighted their hypocrisy and lack of a sound legal basis in their argument. On criticisms over the drastic reduction of directly elected councillors after the electoral overhaul, the statement said no region in the world will allow political power to fall into the hands of forces or individuals who do not love or betray their own country. And the revamped election system will comprehensively reflect public opinion, the statement said. The SAR government also lambasted the U.S. for making no mention of the riots in 2019 in Hong Kong and how the United States has at least 21 pieces of national security-related legislation, stating it is in no position to point its finger at other regions for making their own legitimate laws for safeguarding national security. In the U.S., work is beginning to clear the wreckage of the Francis Scott Key Bridge, the massive ship and its containers. The largest floating crane on the east coast of the U.S. has arrived in Baltimore. NBC News has more.
Arriving at the site of Baltimore's bridge collapse, the biggest floating crane on the East Coast, able to lift 1,000 tons for one of the biggest salvage missions ever. Just part of a flotilla now en route, including the crane that lifted the Miracle on the Hudson plane out of the river. In all, 7 floating cranes, 10 tugboats, 9 barges, 8 salvage vessels, and 5 Coast Guard boats. 8,000 local jobs are waiting.
We need to clear the channel and open the vessel traffic to the port, because the health of the Maryland economy and the national economy depend on it.
On the water, the Army Corps of Engineers is using underwater drones and sonar to map the precise location of the wreckage, then lay out a coordinated salvage plan for divers.
How we can cut it up into the pieces we need to be able to lift.
NTSB investigators still interviewing crew members and gathering evidence on the crushed cargo ship, now trapped under the weight of twisted steel, a piece of highway lying on top. So take a look at the front of the ship, at the bow of the ship, and you see that piece of steel that's lying across it. That's 3,000 to 4,000 tons. That is so heavy, it's pushing the bow into the water, down into the bottom of the river, and then it's lifting the stern up out of the water. Below the waterline, the river depth is roughly 50 feet. To reopen the port, the cranes will lift massive chunks of steel, concrete, and sunken cargo containers, some hazardous. All of it must be gone. The sand on the bottom, completely clean.
You can't leave any concrete, any steel, because it's a threat to the vessel. We're going to get it all off the bottom and reopen this channel so it provides for safe navigation.
Meanwhile, in Honduras, construction worker Menor Martin Suazo's family in a heart-wrenching wait for his body to be recovered from the water in Baltimore. His brother saying, "We are still waiting with faith and hope that they will find his body so we can bring him home."
With cleanup efforts already underway in Baltimore, the tragedy has brought America's bridges into the spotlight. Engineers say tens of thousands of bridges in the U.S. are in need of urgent repair. Nasty Kareem has more.
This is the Fishing Wars Memorial Bridge of the Puyallup River in Washington state. Closed again because of safety concerns after reopening in 2019, boasting a sturdy new span and taking on 15,000 vehicles a day. The closure has hit businesses in the region hard, such as Brandon Bauer's Big Truck Service Center.
You couldn't walk across the highway. The traffic was so bad. Now, you can take your sweet time. Our workflow's probably down about 30-35% from where we were at this time last year. So, I mean, we're a small business, so we just watch our spending.
It paints a similar picture, though on a smaller scale and without the tragedy, to the Francis Scott Key Bridge in Baltimore, where a massive cargo ship plowed into one of its pillars, collapsing the bridge into the water. 2 people were killed and 4 are missing, presumed dead, and the economic ripples are expected to affect the entire state of Maryland and possibly the U.S. northeastern coast. It highlights the major roles bridges play in the United States economy, but more importantly, according to engineers, the poor state of such structures across the country.
We have not maintained our infrastructure at the rate that we should for many, many years. And now we're trying to play catch up.
Analysts say about 42,400 bridges in the U.S. are in poor condition, carrying a total of 167 million vehicles a day. 80% have problems with the legs holding them up or the arms supporting their load. Close to 15,800 of them were also in bad state 10 years ago.
So there's still quite a bit of work to be done. 1 in 3 bridges across the United States need some sort of repair or reconstruction work.
In 2021, US President Joe Biden allocated $40 billion to bridges over 5 years. Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg said it funds more than 7,800 bridge projects, including a $3.6 billion construction in Cincinnati. Black says it is far short of the $319 billion needed nationwide. As Baltimore prepares for a massive cleanup operation, the fate of other bridges big and small across the country are now firmly in the spotlight. Nazri Karim, TVB News.
And still ahead, a look at how Easter is celebrated across the world. And discover how Louis Cha's legendary martial arts novels are translated into English. Christians around the world are celebrating Easter. That includes in Gaza, where a few Christians live in the predominantly Muslim population. David Garrett reports.
This may not sound and look like Gaza. These church hymns are a far cry from the war that has been associated with the Strip over the last 6 months. But some Christians in the enclave are able to celebrate Easter despite danger all around. 1,300 Christians live in Gaza, with many more in the West Bank. Dozens displaced are sheltering at this church in Gaza City. Hundreds were at the Good Friday service, but the director of the shelter, George Antun, says times are tough. A building next to our church was bombed. Our church is filled with shrapnel. We practice our religion under fear, under repression. Thousands were at the ancient Colosseum in Rome, but the Pope was not. 5 minutes before Pope Francis was expected for the Good Friday Way of the Cross ceremony, the Vatican announced he would not be coming, they said, to protect his health. The 87-year-old has breathing difficulties and has struggled to make speeches. He was not seen on Palm Sunday, but was at prayers earlier on Friday at St. Peter's Basilica. Brian travelled all the way from Chicago.
I definitely don't think it was a decision taken lightly. I think a lot was taken into it, and I think he probably prioritized his health for Easter, which I think is a very responsible thing to do. I mean, definitely, I know he's been going through a lot this year, so I don't expect him to be able to make every event.
In Chicago, hundreds watched the reenacting of Jesus Christ's final days. As is tradition, actors used this Chicago neighborhood as a stage to act out the story of his capture by the Romans and crucifixion. The crowd filmed on their phone as the actor playing Jesus, Tony Diaz, shouted pain into a microphone.
En tus manos.
The organisers said this street theatre, played out in real time, is a timely reminder of the suffering and the strength and the passion that their Lord had. The same scene played out in the favelas of Rio. They have been doing the same thing on Good Friday for the last 2 decades. People crowded around and leaned on rooftops so they could catch a glimpse of the spectacle. This woman, who was clearly moved, says it brings poor people together. She says the love of Christ helps them feel a sense of community. The community in Haiti reflecting on a difficult time. Gang violence is engulfing the country. The Prime Minister has resigned. Hundreds have died, with law enforcers overwhelmed. Many Easter festivities have been forced inside. The streets are too dangerous. Still, hundreds attend this church amid the threat. The leader of the congregation admitted the Caribbean country is living at a time of misery, death and murder. Some of the dead were remembered and parishioners sang and prayed for peace. David Garrett, TVB News.
The city recorded some 610,000 people crossing the border on the second day of the Easter holidays as of 4 p.m. Around 365,000 residents departed the SAR, slightly fewer than yesterday's tally. There were noticeably fewer people queuing at the border crossings and the Shengshui MTR station today. Travelers could also pass through the Hengyuwai control point, which operated more smoothly compared with yesterday. Traffic remains congested for motorists traveling up north, with vehicles having to wait in long queues on the Hong Kong-Zhuhai-Macau Bridge. Chief Executive John Lee said the government will establish care teams dedicated to supporting ethnic minorities in Hong Kong.
I try to do for Hong Kong to create a place, create a home in which you really find it both warm, comforting, and full of love.
In a social media post, John Lee said he visited a service center for ethnic minorities in Wan Chai, alongside his wife and Secretary for Home and Youth Affairs Alice Mack. He said each of the 10 service centers for ethnic minorities will form its own care team to proactively reach out to such residents. This year marks the centenary of the birth of renowned Chinese novelist Louis Cha, better known by his pen name Jin Yong. Some of Jin Yong's novels have been translated into other languages, bringing his martial arts universe to non-Chinese readers worldwide. TVB News spoke with Gigi Chang, a longtime translator for Jin Yong's works. There's hardly anyone who speaks Chinese who don't know Jin Yong or his stories. The same rings true for Gigi Chang, who translated Jin Yong's Condor trilogy for a decade, including the legends of the Condor heroes.
I grew up in the 80s and 90s, and at that point, television shows with adapted from Jin Yong stories were all the rage all around Asia. Just by telling people, oh, what do? I read Jin Yong every day, that's my work. And you don't know how, like, everyone's so jealous.
Gigi grew up in Hong Kong before she went to study art history at a British university and began her translation career. But she admits translating Jin Yong's novels laden with traditional literary and cultural references is no easy task.
We have to find a new language to convey the Kung Fu system in Chinese culture that embodies philosophy, so traditional medicine, the whole a completely different understanding of the human body, of how strength is generated. It's not just from muscles and bones. There is the internal Kung Fu, Nei Gong. That requires quite a lot of work.
Such work includes not just research, but also numerous visits to the former home of Jin Yong in Haining in Zhejiang province, as well as famous settings in Jin Yong's wuxia universe, such as Chongyang Temple on Mount Zhongnan, featured in the legend of the Condor heroes, and Mount Hua in Shanxi province.
When we're translating, really try to capture that Chinese reading experience, which is rip-roaring fun as well as unputdownable.
Gigi also hopes to enrich readers' experience beyond just literal translation.
By choosing words that can reflect either the speed, the power, or the control of their movement, like skate, scheme, and slide, these are quite fast words. Or they would duck and dodge instead of avoid or evade, because that's a sense of control. Or they might be struggling or slogging around. So all that, those words have sounds that are kind of lower and slower. With Chinese martial arts names, they are quite poetic. Say Kong Long Yao Fui, which we translated as haughty dragon repents. So the haughty part is the sort of aggressive outward pushing part of one's energy, and the repents is the drawing back, the withdrawing of that force. It's trying to keep that sort of tension still within the translated title itself.
As Jin Yong's stories and adventures are packed with self-discovery, friendship, loyalty, and spirit of service, Gigi said these are all universal values that can transcend cultures and resonate across generations. Gigi is now working on the second of the 4 volumes of The Return of the Condor Heroes, which is expected to be ready for publication next year. Gigi also said she will continue delivering talks and seminars in China and Southeast Asia to promote the legacy of the literary titan. 12 local artists with intellectual disability made their debuts at Art Basel Hong Kong this year. Zakarib talked with one of the artists.
A neighborhood by a mysterious lakeside with rainbow sky and dazzling stars. This is the dream city of Basa, a 16-year-old student with mild intellectual disability from Hongqi Association who created a drawing on her tablet using her fingertips.
You see the stars, think about your parents, about your father, grandma and grandson, no? And your aunt, brother and sister always take care of you. And the rainbow means always be together like a family together. Drawing is my best to help others to feel happy like a potato.
Together with other 11 special artists, aged from 10 to 57 years old, each with different levels of intellectual disability, Basel made her debut at Art Basel in the NGO's exhibition Being and Belonging. It showcases 12 paintings at the cafeteria run by Hong Kong Tourism Board, including this line drawing by Basel's brother. How many faces can you count? If you're looking for adventure at sea, this deep-sea diver could guide you. The artists were invited to share their creative experiences as well as challenges. The NGO behind the project wants to show off the work of these artists to global stage.
And I think creative arts, performing arts, visual arts are things that go beyond the boundary. So if there would be opportunity for their talent to be displayed, I think it opens up a whole new world. They are also contributing to the mega event that Hong Kong is hosting at the moment. Very often, I think people see people with disability being a taker of services, but actually, they're also the givers.
For the first time, Art Basel is working with an NGO unrelated to the arts.
Art Basel is not only a platform for a commercial purpose, but also to bring the community together, including people outside of the art world, because art doesn't only serve the purpose of being aesthetics or buying and selling, but also art is a therapeutic method for many of us that we can engage with on a daily basis.
The curator of Art Basel said the team will look into opportunities where they can expand impact and influence to support people who need art. Sakura Yip, TVB News.
As Paris gears up for July's Olympic Games, Versailles is preparing to host equestrian events. The gardens of the Versailles Palace will welcome thousands of visitors as the site prepares to host equestrian and modern pentathlon. Temporary facilities including grandstands are being built with up to 40,000 people expected to attend. And that's the news. Thank you for watching.